Hi, my name is Eileen Tokita. I'm known as the Egg Lady, and I have a dear friend named Colleen. Colleen came up with this idea to do an egg centerpiece for her daughter's wedding. Well, we soon realized that we were going to have to make about 3 dozen of these, one for every single table. Colleen, would you like to show the finished product? And as we were sitting one day working on these eggs together, we thought, it would be really fun to show the process, because I'm sure most people don't have a clue what goes into making that egg. So that's why this little thing has come about. This is called Egging 101. So first of all, we need to find an egg that is relatively even on both sides, and all eggs do not come that way. Most eggs are very pointed. So maybe I may have had to have 100 eggs so that I could find 36 eggs that fit the requirement. And then the next step is that I have to mark it. And I'll show you later, but I use an egg marker. It's a very unusual little contraption, but it helps me put the design on the egg. And then the next step is to cut it. I use a Dremel, and this egg is called a rhea egg. The spelling is R-H-E-A. It's one of the birds in a family of raytite birds. They are flightless birds. And I thought it would be interesting because the bird looks similar to an ostrich. But this is an ostrich egg, and see how different the eggs are. This is such an oval egg, this is such a round egg. But these are all flightless birds, and if you saw these birds in the field, they would look like they're related. So then after the cutting, the next step is something that I think is sort of interesting, because normally you would think that I would discard this piece and just put maybe a piece of cardboard in there. But I've decided to save this and reverse it. See, that was cut from the top. Reverse it, and it's held with surgical tape. And then I will epoxy this into the egg before I go to the next step, which is painting the eggs. So I spray painted these eggs, probably about 3 coats. And then I tried something new, so that's why these eggs are shinier than the last egg. But I tried to seal it with porcelain spray. So this is the way it looks at this stage. Now, one of the things that I do that I think I'm the only one who does this is I put a fabric on the cut edge, and we call it lame. And the purpose of it is to cover up this raw cut edge, so that in case you didn't cut very well, or in case you have a hole in the egg. See, there's usually a hole where the farmer takes the innards out of the egg. So when the eggs come to me, they already come blown and disinfected. So I don't have to deal with the egg. But what we need to do is to epoxy that hole over. So that's another good reason for the lame being there. It covers up that little patch job. So then after we glue this fabric on, then the next step is to line the egg. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this would be a great coffin for my bird, but if you say that in front of me, you're going to be in trouble. And then what we do after we line it, and we're going to demo that later, we put cording on this gathers to make everything look nice and finished. So I don't think any of these have that cording on it except for the finished one. So you want to show that? Yeah. So that kind of finishes the inside of the egg. Then the next step, after both halves are completely finished, then we put the egg together to hinge the egg. And there's a lot to hinging an egg. When I cut the egg, I put a little notch in the center back. So we have to locate that notch, and then we place the hinge on the center point, and then what we have to do is cut the lame away from that hinge area, And then we even go so far as to scrape the paint away because it's not safe to glue the hinge to a painted egg. The paint might lift. We also contour the hinge with a needle nose plier before we use 5-minute epoxy. That's another thing. We use 5-minute epoxy, and occasionally if I glue an egg that's going to get a lot of use, I will even drill holes in the hinge and put nails in. But in this case, we're just gluing the hinge down. So then once we glue the hinge down, then we put on a decorative piece. Colleen, you want to show on that one? To cover the hinge. It's just a filigree, and we call it a hinge cover. And then the next step is to trim the egg. So all of the trim will start and stop at the hinge. So the glue is placed on the egg first with a toothpick, and then we apply the cord, then the rhinestone chain, and then the cord. We do that to the top and bottom. And then the next step is to mount the egg on the stand. And this is kind of a fun thing, but what you have to be very aware of is that not all stands are very straight. So this piece at the bottom is Corian, and I've sprayed it black to go with the color scheme. Mari's colors are black and silver. And what we do is we mix 5-minute epoxy and we place it into the cup. We call this a cup. And then when you mount the egg, you have to almost get down on your hands and knees because the egg has to be parallel to the table. So we have to actually crouch down and then mount the egg. And then once we mount the egg, the final step is to put this silver cord on this oval, and then we've taken this fantastic Swarovski brooch and we remove the pin back, and this is the final piece de resistance on the top of the egg. Oh, and then she just reminded me the last step is to put in this little dainty chain, and that's to prevent the lid from falling backwards. And so the length of the chain is important because we don't like it to be too far back. We want it to look very dainty so that we have kind of a 45-degree angle. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to show you in detail a couple of the steps. Okay, I'm just going to demonstrate how I mark the egg. So this is actually a commercial egg marker. There's different ones out on the market, but I like this one. The first thing to do is to get this stylus and my pencil right at 0. Even though they give you this little notch, it never works. So I always check my positioning by doing this step. I do this for every single egg. Now you see there's a separation in those two lines, so that's how far off I am. So I have to get that dead center. And until I get it dead center, my mark is not correct. Okay, I think that's going to be correct now. So, and you have to do this for every single one because this thing does move. You'll see my egg even moved in the marker. Okay, let's try it again. And see, this is something that I usually do for my students. Okay, now it's right on. So now I can turn it to its proper position. And this first line is very important. Almost all eggs start this way. I have to divide the egg in half horizontally. So, and I'm working on this piece of acrylic because it's very important that your surface is smooth and flat. Then I'm going to make that perpendicular mark. See, this is theoretically where the egg should be blown out, but the farmer doesn't have an egg marker. so I've got the 2 marks on the ends. Now, to do the oval, I make a mark that's 1.5 inches from the horizontal line, and then I'm going to use this one because this one took so long in positioning. I'm going to actually use another stylist. And this is kind of interesting because by doing the oval in this manner, the oval will always be compatible to the shape of the egg. So, you know, not all eggs are shaped the same. Some are fat, some are long. If I make the oval in this way rather than use a plastic template, the oval will match the shape of the egg. So this is how I make that oval. It's important that the egg doesn't move, so I'm kind of holding.
Eileen, you were talking about the farmer blowing out the egg. You might want to tell them that these are infertile eggs that are being used.
Right. Colleen brought up something that I guess is important to a lot of people. The farmer does not sacrifice his birds just to sell me the shell. What they do is they candle the eggs, and at a certain stage, if there's no embryo, then they empty the egg because they know that it's infertile. So we're not killing potential little Rias. Okay, so this is how I mark the egg. The last thing that I need to do, and I didn't bring it with me, but I use a strip of paper that I hold from one end to the other so that I get the measurement, the lengthwise measurement, and then I fold that paper in half to find dead center. And then that gives me the mark for the hinge. So that's the marking of the egg. So I'm going to cut the oval first before I cut the egg in half. Here I have to score this so that when the egg separates, it won't chip. There's a little rough spot. Good. To notch a hinge. After I cut the eggshell, rather than discard this piece, which came from the top of the egg. See, the reason why I cut the oval out is because if you tried to glue that pin onto this curved surface, it would not lay properly. So I had the idea to reverse the oval. So what I'm going to do is just create a little shelf for the eggshell to sit on while I glue it. And I'm going to glue it in with epoxy. There's a little bit of thickness to the blade, so you can't help but get a little bit of space. So that space needs to be filled in. And I fill it in with 5-minute epoxy. So epoxy has a resin and a hardener, and you need to mix the resin and a hardener for 1 minute, and then you have about 5 minutes to use it. There's different types of epoxy. There's 1 hour, I think there's 12 hour, but in the egg business, we use pretty much always 5-minute epoxy. So this is a little piece of microfiche that I'm working on. You could work on plastic or a tile. And it's important that these two parts, they call it resin and hardener, are mixed thoroughly. And then I'm going to fill in the space. So you want to fill it in, but you don't want to create too much relief, because we're going to put 1 row of cord here, and if it's really bumpy or high, then the cord doesn't sit down well. Actually, what we also should have close by is a little handy wipe. That's something that my students were so surprised. Handy wipes usually are used by people. Well, I guess initially they weren't called handy wipes. I think they were called diaper wipes or something like that. And then so we were laughing because we're saying, gee, I don't think people realize that they're wiping their baby's bottom with something that will cut epoxy. So it's pretty potent. But that's what we use to take the epoxy off of our hands and off of a lot of the objects. Because I guess it's the alcohol in the handy wipe. See, it would really help if the epoxy was white or a different color, because then you could see. But as soon as I spray this black, all the little holes that I missed will show up. So you can always go back and touch it up again. Okay, so the good thing about this is that it'll only take 5 minutes to set up. Okay, so that's that step. Okay, I'm showing all of the steps, not only because it's sort of interesting, but so that you can all run home and make your own egg after you watch this. Here's my lining. And I don't know if you can tell, but these are not the same size. And Colleen suggested that it would be interesting for you to know how I get the pattern. So what I do is I actually wrap the egg. Once it's cut in half, I wrap it in old tissue paper. And I just literally wrap it. Because what I'm going to do is mark this edge. And it's crude, but it works. And because, if you notice, Colleen, you want to hold the one that's lined?
Oh.
And because the lining is kind of swirly, and the reason that it is swirly is because once I do this and I come up with a pattern and it's going to be an oval, I actually add about not 2 inches, probably an inch, maybe 2 inches to the size of this. And that's how you get those swirly little gathers. So it may be hard to see because there's not that much contrast here, but this actually did create an oval. If the egg had a, let's say a dip, a point, that would show up also. So then my lining would not be oval shaped, it would have a dip in it. So that's my pattern. Does that show up? And so actually, before I cut it, the actual lining, yeah, I guess I add about an inch. So my actual pattern is going to be larger than the actual size of the egg. But that's how I achieve the pattern. And if you really want it to be really accurate and precise, because all eggs are different, you would make a pattern for every single egg. But I don't think we did. We cheated, but
And
that's
the top and the
see I did the bottom, that's the bigger side, and then this, of course, because of this oval, it's going to be smaller, so that's why I have the smaller size. Okay, so now this is crepe back satin, and I want to show you the novel way that I lined the egg, and I think it's actually a pretty good little thing that I discovered, because when I first took Jewel Box 101 from another teacher, they taught me to use a needle and thread and gather the edge of the egg. Well, once I gathered it, I had this mess of a gather, and then I still had to find a way to get that into the egg. So this is why I do it in this way. What I do is I make 4 little points on the egg, dividing this lining into quarters. So I don't cut into it, but what I do is I just put a little crease in it by giving it a good squeeze. So I'm putting 4 little creases in it, which is dividing the fabric into quarters. And then in turn, I put the glue into the egg in 4 spots: north, south, east, west. So that's my north. That's actually would be the center front. This is the center back. Now this is another interesting thing that I think is unique to my crazy mind. When I look at an egg that is decorated horizontally, for some reason, I like the fat end of the egg to be on the right-hand side. So that's why I know where front is, because I always put the fat end on the right-hand side. Maybe it's because I'm right-handed. Okay, so now I've put the glue in the 4 spots: north, south, east, and west. Okay? Now I'm going to match up my little creases to those 4 spots. So now I've really gone past, I think, the most difficult part of the whole process is getting the lining into the egg. So now it's into the egg. So now what I do is I pull back 1/4 section at a time and gather just that 1/4 section. And you have to use a lot of glue, and in this instance you want old glue, thick, sticky old glue. So I actually have a tub that's just for lining, because if the lining glue is too wet, as soon as you gather it, it'll pop right back in your face. Put the fabric into the egg by matching up the 4 points of glue to the 4 little creases, and I put glue on this 1/4 section. So now I'm going to just gather that 1/4 section. So I just pick up very tiny amounts of the fabric, and you want to keep it below the cut edge. And these aren't pleats, these are just tiny little gathers. And I hold it with my thumbnail. If your glue starts to dry, which I think is happening, just add a little more glue. See, because this glue is extremely thick. Okay. You notice how I keep pulling the fabric down because I don't want it to stick up. The final step will be to cover these gathers with a decorative cord, and I want that cord to truly cover all of these gathers. I don't want to see any little bits of white fabric sticking up, so that's why I keep pushing the fabric down. So you want it maybe 1/8 of an inch at least below the cut edge. Probably it's a little difficult to see because I'm working against the silver background. Okay, now I've come to my 1/4 section. So now I want to gather up that little flat area. I don't want it to remain flat. Okay, so now I'm ready for my next 1/4 section. Through the magic of television, I lined the egg. So now I'm going to put glue on the top of my gathers because I want to cover all of this to give it the final finish. I'm going to cover it with a pretty decorative cord. You see, I use quite a bit of glue, but I control where it goes. You know, I never realized this, but my students told me, "Do you realize you twirl your toothpick?" And I'm going, "Oh, I do." And I do that because I'm trying to get all the glue that's on my toothpick, off of the toothpick and onto the object. It's not because I'm trying to be like a slick egg teacher. There is a reason. But see, you never get a globby toothpick that way. Your toothpick is always clean. Okay, so now I'm going to cover it with this cord. It's important that you put glue on the top of the cord as well as underneath, because this cord is intricately made and sometimes it unravels or frays. Now, what I have to do is realize where is my center front. This is the center front, because remember I told you I like the fat end of the egg on the right? So that's where I'm going to start my cord, because when you open the egg, your eye goes to the back. So I'm going to put my join opposite the back. So there is a reason for everything. So you see how I put the cord a little bit below the cut edge? And that's very important, because if the cord is too high, when you go to put the egg together, the two halves won't sit properly. So you want to make sure that it's below the cut edge. you go to join these two edges, they should not overlap, they should butt. So what I do is I put glue on the top of the cord because I don't want it to fray. I actually put it too far over. Okay, then I put my scissor up against the previous cut, and that tells me where to cut it. So now these two. Okay, so now I've covered this. And if necessary, put a little bit of glue on top because you don't want it to fray. And you do the same to the top and the bottom, and then we're ready for hinging. So this is always the rule. When you make a jewelry box, you finish the inside. Then you put the two halves together, and then you hinge the egg. Sometimes we even put a music box inside. And there are other times when we weight the inside with buckshot to give the egg a center of gravity. Because the stand in this case is so heavy, it's sitting on corian, we don't need the buckshot. But normally in jewel boxes, I put about a tablespoon of buckshot. Okay, so now we're ready for hinging. Okay, now that I have finished the inside, top and bottom, I'm ready to put the two halves together and hinge the egg. Now, what I did when I cut the egg was I drilled a little notch in the center back because I knew that once it was painted, once the lame was on, everything would be covered. All my marks get covered, but I could physically feel the notch. So I cheated and I located the notch while we were off camera. And this is going to be a challenge because normally I would put some surgical tape on both ends, maybe even front and back, to keep the egg together. Because it's a straight cut, it's difficult to hold the egg together. But because of the nature of the paint, I don't want to put tape. So I'm going to center the hinge on the notch, and I'm going to draw around it because whenever you glue a hinge onto the egg, you cannot glue it onto the lame, and really you should not glue it onto the paint. You should glue it onto the actual eggshell. So I need to indicate where I have to do a lot of work. So that's where my hinge would go. So now I'm going to cut out the lame. So you've got to have a good point on your scissor to do this step. See, and that side's even gotten dull. Okay. See, the reason for the lame is to give you a nice finished look when you open the eggshell. And incidentally, I cut the lame into strips. It's just fabric. It doesn't come in strips. That's another thing that people go, "You cut it?" And I go, "Yes, I cut it." Now I'm using a dental chisel to scrape the paint away. You could use an X-Acto. There's a lot of things you could use. This egg happens to be a Rhea an emu egg. We couldn't find enough eggs that were suitable out of my rheas because rheas are hard to get this year. So this is an emu egg, and it's another bird in the raytite classification, flightless bird, and another bird that looks similar to an ostrich. And the egg itself is actually an avocado color, so it looks like an avocado. So that's why you're not seeing white emerge when I scrape, because the actual egg is really a dark green. But it's important that you scratch it because you are taking the paint away. So then what I'm going to do is mix 5-minute epoxy and actually glue the hinge down. So again, for all of our metal components, we use epoxy. So I just need a little bit, and I'm also going to show you another little thing that we put on. The hinge is not the right color, it's silver. I mean, it's gold, and we needed it to be silver. So we put a little decorative finding on the hinge, and it is silver.
Do you have your tweezer?
Yes, I have one here. Thanks, Colleen. Okay. So it's important that you push all of the epoxy that's on the edge to the center. So you just don't stir it like you're stirring a cake. You really want to get all the epoxy mixed thoroughly. Now I've mixed a lot, much more than would be necessary for one hinge, but I'm going to do two things in this one step. I'm going to glue the hinge and the hinge cover. Now when I mix epoxy for hinges, I actually go a little longer than a minute. And if you have no sense of time, you can watch the second hand on your watch. But I can kind of sense it. Okay, so you always put the glue onto the egg, not the hinge. Another thing I do to prepare the hinge, and I've already done it, is I actually take a needle nose plier and I slightly contour the hinge, because the hinge is perfectly flat, but you're putting it onto a curved surface. So I don't want to make big crooks in the corner, but I actually just slightly contour the hinge. And then another little tip is when I put the hinge down, I put it down so that it's slightly bent, not perfectly flat, because then it gives me the opportunity to flatten it out a little on the egg. Okay, so now, see, now there's actually a couple of holes here, and if I really wanted to be extra careful that I would never lose this hinge, or it would never come off, then I would actually physically drill holes where these holes are and then put little nails into the hinge. Okay. Another thing I do is I offset the pin of the hinge to the lid. And I do that for decorative purposes. Okay, my last little step, and don't do this unless you're advanced, because this is really scary. See, normally my hinge would already be rock hard. But what I'm trying to do is put a little glue high You notice I'm building it up so that there's some height to it. But this is for the hinge cover. So I'm trying to be okay, so now I'm going to pick up the hinge cover and glue it on. See, the reason why I put the glue high is because the hinge cover is a little bit curved. It's not perfectly flat. Okay, so now we just need to wait for another about 4 minutes till it sets up. You don't want to put the egg down and go do something because this hinge will slide and you won't be very happy. If you do have a tragedy and the hinge does slide, or if you get epoxy in the hinge, you can use a soldering iron and it will loosen the epoxy. So you just have to hold it until it sets up. Okay, so now we're ready to start decorating the cut edge of the egg. And this is the cord that I'm going to use. And if there are any of my students watching this, they'll be chuckling because they'll go, oh yes, the trick, remove the string trick. If there's string inside of the cord, I recommend that you remove it because it makes it easier when you're making your cuts and your mitering so that you don't have to contend with fuzzy white string. So you want to gently remove the string. Now we're going to put the glue on the egg. And you want to work with the egg closed. Everyone goes, but I'm going to glue my egg shut, but you won't. Just open it. Don't go to bed. Open it. And then you don't have to worry. But you want the cord that is above and below the cut edge to touch. So you do want these two cords to be very close together. And the only way to achieve that is to keep the egg closed. You can't do it by opening the egg up. And even though I recommend it this way, I always see my students decorating their eggs with their egg open. So don't listen. If you find that you cannot work quickly enough, then you can just put glue on part of the egg, lay the cord down, and then add more glue. So now, because the area where I'm starting will take the cord straight, sometimes I cut it at an angle, but in this case I cut it straight. So I want to put glue on that cut. And then start at the hinge. See, right there I had a little spot of glue, so I know right there is gonna, you want to stick to the other side, but I can always remove that. It's very important very important that this row is straight. Okay, now I'm gonna cut the cord here. I put a little glue on there and then cut straight. I have to squish it in there. Okay, now I'm going to put the glue on the top so that I can do the cord on the top. Okay. You see how these two cords are right next to each other? In theory, you should not be able to tell where the egg opens once all the trim is on. That's how consistent these rows should be. There should be no gaps. Okay, the next row is going to help you to straighten these first two rows. Okay, I got to put the glue. Okay, the next row is rhinestone chain. This is Tiffany's set rhinestone chain. It's very expensive because you're paying for the fact that every stone has been set individually. And that's why it's called Tiffany's set rhinestone chain. So here it is, and first I have to put the glue. Actually, I think I'm finally gonna have to admit I need a new toothpick. Okay, yeah, always try to work with a clean instrument. What I'm using is Eileen's, they call it designer tacky glue. So it's a glue that's a little thicker than Elmer's. Okay, so now I'm going to lay the rhinestone chain, and you want to stretch the chain. You don't want to scrunch up the chain because you want to see the individually set stones. I don't know if you can tell, but this egg is an emu egg, and it's more textured than the Rhea. So it's not as smooth and slick. Okay, you need to cut this chain with a wire cutter. Okay, now we're going to do the top. You know, it's interesting because unless you actually sit down and make an egg yourself, you could never imagine that this much work goes into one egg. But if you enjoy this kind of work, it's fun. And if you don't, then you'll be sitting for a long time doing something you don't like to do. But you know, when you think of the fact that you start with just an ordinary egg and create something of value, of beauty, it makes it worth it. And it makes it very exciting every time you make one. Okay, so now we're going to do the chain again. there's quite a variation in the size of these eggs, because the more mature birds lay the bigger eggs. The young birds lay the small eggs. Okay, then the final step is the last row of gold cord.
Did you say gold?
Oh, oh yeah, silver. Sorry, guys. It's just that truly we always use gold. But for Mari's wedding, it's silver. So we had to buy special. And then we had to plate the chain special. Normally they plate it gold, but we had to get it plated silver. And we had to get silver stands. So there's a lot of special things about this egg. It's kind of interesting too. We found this pin, and Colleen and I both like beautiful Swarovski things. But the pin was something that I had in my possession for about 2 or 3 years. So when we found the source, they actually had to create a new mold and put it back in production for us. So this is even more special. So first time I ever saw a lady that had a huge egg collection, it was love at first sight. And I discovered egg decorating in, of all places, Montgomery, Alabama. So from there I came to Honolulu. And that was like, what, 1975 or 74. So I guess I've been doing this a long time. But I started when I was 10. So I need my handy wipe. See, and then I'm going to use the handy wipe to clean up any little glue I have. Then I also think it would be a good idea to see if I have glued this egg shut. So I'm going to open it. Yes, it opens. That is a good thing. See this one. Also, I don't know if I mentioned it, but whenever you epoxy the hinge, open it after 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Because there's always a chance that you might get epoxy into the pin of the hinge. So I'm trying to work fast. So I think if I was working slower, I'd be a little bit neater. Okay, the last row of cord. Put a little glue. I'm going to put the cord on the top of the egg, and it actually gives me something for the pin to get glued to. So that serves a couple of purposes. It hides any little flaws I have, hides the seam where I reversed the oval, and then it gives me something to glue the pin to. When I do trimming like this, for some reason, I feel that if you cut the cord at a 45-degree angle, your join isn't as obvious. So I've always done that. Put a little glue there. I'm going to put the join in the back. Again, what I do is put my scissor up against the previous cut so that I can cut this so that the two cords butt, or the two ends I should say, butt, not overlap. That's actually too much glue, but you put the egg down and then you check to see, does the glue actually touch the egg? Because in this instance, because the egg is horizontal, a lot of times it doesn't even make contact. So the glue has to be very close to the rim. And then of course when it's still wet, it's very runny, so it has a tendency to run to the middle. Almost have to keep playing with it until it starts to thicken up a bit. So now I have to get down eye level to mount the egg. So once I touch it down, I lift it up to make sure it's touching. We're going to cut the pin off of the brooch. Wow. This is truly is the final step. You make a pocket between the lining and the lame, and you put one end of the chain with a little tacky glue, and then you hold it until it sets up. Then you close the egg and find a spot right next to it, and you do the same. You open up a pocket with the lining and between the lining and the lame, and a lot of times I'll have to hold the egg like this to drop the other end of the chain in. Put a little pocket, open up a little pocket, put a little tacky glue in there, and then put the other end in. Now, what is important is that the length of the chain should allow the egg to open, but not fully open to a 90-degree angle. It looks much daintier if it's more like a 45-degree angle, like that. This egg is very top heavy though because of that brooch, so it wants to open up a little larger. So anywhere from here to where it is fine. This just, I don't know, makes it a little dainty. So there's the finished product.